You're listening to Best Forevers, a podcast for kindred spirits, a podcast that encourages you to love more in your friends and to further consider the issues that plague friendships. I'm Alysa Lucas, and I think I love friendship because I probably wouldn't have this podcast if I didn't. But I also believe that friendships are often neglected or viewed as a secondary relationship in comparison to other important relationships in our life. Therefore, I don't think we get our questions about friendships answered as frequently as we should. So today, I'm starting my advice series of Best Forevers called Asking for a Friend. And I'm super proud of myself for coming up with that name. You probably know how proud I am. That's a good name. So you'll see every once in a while I'll take questions from listeners. You can send them to me via social media at Best Forevers Pod on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. You can send me an email at bestforeverspod@gmail.com because I want to hear from you. What questions would you like answered? What topics would you like me to discuss? And then also, if you have any response to the questions that were asked, any responses to my answers, then I want to hear that too. I'm open to it all because friendships should be front and center at least part of the time. So I had some folks send in questions, and unless otherwise noted, I'm using pseudonyms either provided by the listener or that I've created based off my TV binge sessions. So if you've listened in the last few months, that's what I do when I have listener letters, emails, questions, things like that. I always take their name and then I change it based on what I'm watching. So Gossip Girl, I'll change it to Serena and Chuck, it doesn't matter. Brooklyn Nine-Nine, we got Jake, we got Terry, we got all sorts of people. But for today, I'm using names from America's Next Top Model. Because I started back with season 1 because like Tyra says, I wanted to take my binge watching to the next level. Okay, clearly I've already been watching way too much America's Next Top Model, and I might need your help because my spring break starts today. And so if you have any recommendations for TV shows that I could enjoy on a binge sesh, let me know. I've got a few in the works for the next week and a half. But let's not wait to help our friends any longer. Let's go ahead and start answering questions. Again, unless otherwise noted, I've changed their names to people that have been on the first 3 seasons of America's Next Top Model because that's where I'm at after the last 4 or 5 days. I might need an intervention. Okay, the first question that was asked by Jay, and it says, what does a true best friend look like? And Jay, I think that a true best friend can be conceived in many different ways. I think we have a general conception of what a friend is, right? We know that friends spend most of their time talking. We know that friends are supposed to be equals. They're supposed to share each other's secrets. They're supposed to provide support and do all sorts of things that are enjoyable and fun and no judgment and all that kind of good stuff. So I think a lot of times when people can check those boxes, they might say that's what a true best friend looks like. However, I think that it depends on what each person might perceive, because for some people, maybe a true best friend is someone who's just been there since day one and has never left their side. So if they're, let's say, 25, that they came out of their mom's womb and all of a sudden they just had like a bestie, right? And so maybe that for them is what a true best friend looks like. Or maybe it's someone who you've waited for your entire life and you don't meet until you're 45 and they just get you, and that would be a true best friend. And so I think we each have our own definition. I think one of the problems that can come up is if people have different definitions of what a true best friend looks like. And I think that you can have problems if that conflicts, because if someone believes that sharing secrets is the number one thing that a true best friend does, but that's not what their true best friend thinks, then you might find that a secret might get told, and that might sort of bring up some conflict and cause some problems. So what I would say to you is, how do you view a true best friend? Is there someone in your life that is your best friend and you call them a best friend, and maybe you haven't sort of, I don't know, we don't have to make a list, but do you make a list of what sort of attributes about them is why you love them so much as a friend. That might be what's important. The other thing is I think we can be open to having more than one best friend, or that we don't necessarily need to use that label, because I think that sometimes, I talk about best friends, dear friends. I have different labels that I use, and I do use them, and I realize that there are people, when they hear the labels that I use, might be something that indicates to them, oh, maybe I don't have that kind of friendship. Well, the thing about it is you don't need to use those terms. If you perceive this person to be a good friend to you and they are under those terms, then you have a true best friend. Or you could say, I don't have a true best friend, but I have a group of friends. I have 7 different ride or dies, and they might not all know each other, but for me, they're my support system. So that's what I would say, is that we might always be hoping that we find sort of this magical true best friend. And then to compare it to romantic relationships, maybe that's like finding the one. And, maybe it's possible, maybe it's not. And so I say, as long as you care about them and they care about you and they treat you good and you treat them good, then you got yourself a friend. And that's the most important thing, because friendship is great for our well-being, physically, emotionally, mentally, everything. Jay also has a second question. Thank you, Jay. He has a couple different questions that will be integrated here, and I appreciate the questions. The second one he asks is, do you think you can have a long-term friendship without self-disclosure? And self-disclosure is maybe not a term we use every single day, but I think people know what we mean when we use it. But just in case to get technical, self-disclosure is when we share information about ourselves. And when I teach my interpersonal communication class or my communication theory class, I talk about social penetration theory, which is unfortunately the worst named theory of all time. But it also gets at the idea that to become close with someone, that you need to self-disclose, and that there might be some level of reciprocity. So when I self-disclose, you self-disclose. And you do that through 3 layers, kind of like in Shrek, there is an onion, and just like ogres, onions have layers, and we got to peel them back. And in this scenario, we're not ogres, but we're people. And that we have sort of a superficial layer that we can get through quickly. And then we have sort of the middle layer, which is just all of our interests and things like that, which might take a while. And then we have sort of what I call the hot red zone. This is the check yourself before you wreck yourself zone. And it's very much, these are the things I would only share with a small amount of people. So that's what the theory looks at. And so the idea is that you will be closer to people if you self-disclose. And so what the theory is trying to say is that you will have a friendship or a romantic relationship if you self-disclose and they self-disclose back. However, I do think that there are some people who are more likely to self-disclose than others, right? Have you ever been in line at the grocery store and the person in front of you tells you everything and you're like, cool, thanks. I don't have a story to share here. Or sometimes, it's so funny. Okay, so I love friendships. I love communication. I teach it. I live it. I breathe it. But one of the scenarios I absolutely hate is talking to people on the airplane. And I'll do it. And I've been in situations where my people next to me on the plane have been so helpful to me when I've been sick or this, that, or the other thing. So we've banded together to make it through a flight. But in general, I just want to watch my movies. If I'm lucky enough to get that screen, I want to read my stories. I want to listen to music, listen to my podcast, whatever the case is. So I often have my headphones in, right? Like coming on the plane, I'm like, check out these earbuds. What do you think that means? No talkies during the flight. But one of the things is that a lot of people feel really comfortable talking to others on airplanes because they know they're never going to see them again. But that's not a long-term relationship. And what Jay is asking here is, can you have a long-term relationship without self-disclosure? And I think that there has to be some level of self-disclosure to make any relationship work, because how do you get to know each other and know that you have something in common without some of that sharing? But I don't think that's the only way to maintain a friendship. I don't think it's the only way to establish a friendship. And some people are introverted, some people are shy, some people are quiet, some people don't need to tell everyone about their stuff. Maybe that's all the same person, or it could be 4 different people, and that's fine. And so other things I would say is that you could have a long-term friendship without so much self-disclosure if you have enough to know each other and have a perception of having a good friendship and feeling close, because closeness is nothing but a perception. I could think I was really close to someone else, but they might not perceive it in the same way. And so what I'll do is I will post with this episode a one question survey, if you will. And it's the inclusion of self and other scale. And I'll include the date and the full authors, but I believe it's Aaron, and Smullen. And basically they have 7 different sets of rings that reflect people, and you're each a circle, right? And so 1 would be 2 circles next to each other, and then the 7th circle is completely overlapped. And what it's trying to get at is how you perceive closeness. And if I took that survey and I gave it to my best friend Kate, we could completely circle 2 different sets of rings on there showing closeness. I don't necessarily recommend doing this together. I made the mistake of giving that to Kate and her husband, and then I was like, all right, see you guys later. Try to figure that one out on your own, which is not responsible communication scholarship, I'll tell you that. But I can put it on there, and you can sort of look at your own relationships, whether friendships or not, and see how you perceive your closeness in it. And so I think if you perceive closeness, you can have that long-term friendship. Also, I think that one other thing that is really important to friendships, especially, is activities. So you might not do a whole lot of self-disclosure during that time, but spending time together and bonding over the things that you do together, I think, is another way to establish and maintain a long friendship. I think the most important thing is to know, though, that some people might expect self-disclosure from a friend, and if they don't get it, they might not think that you care. And that might be a misperception, but one of the things would be maybe you could clarify that. Like, I'm a little bit more, I keep things kind of closer to my chest, and it's, nothing about you. I really enjoy our time together. I really like when we do, X, Y, and Z activities. So some of it might just be self-disclosing that you're not a self-discloser. So meta. But that might be helpful so that it's clear to other people, and then you don't have sort of the situation where someone doesn't think that you care when you do. Okay, so I sort of stopped with Jay's questions because there's another person that I'm calling Adrian, who is the first winner of America's Next Top Model, and also the person who's going to ask some questions that I think were relevant to what Jay was asking, right? So Adrian asks, is there usually one friend who puts in more effort than the other? And then she asked a really great follow-up question. If so, can that friendship be considered healthy? Adrian, thanks for your question. One of the things that I would say is that one of the main markers of friendship is that there is a level of equality, that we are peers, that we get to choose each other, that it's a volunteer friendship. And it's not saying that all friendships are like that, but that's generally what people assume, is that when I come into this relationship, what matters about me also matters about you to the same level or to degree. So it might not happen at the same time, but right now it might be like, it's my week to get some social support. But it's not a friendship if one person is always giving the other person social support and they're never getting it back. So one of the things I would say is that there can be a friend who puts in more effort than the other, and that would be an over-benefited relationship where the other friend is getting way more than that person, and that person would be considered to be under-benefited. They're not getting enough. And so I would say, in case of any relationship, when you feel under-benefited, like you're giving everything, you're investing everything, you're putting in all the time, you're inviting them out all the time, you feel like the social director and the person who does the follow-up, then that can weigh on you. Like, that's a lot. And it doesn't feel like you have a friend, because unlike maybe a parent-child relationship, we expect, the back and forth, right? With parents, we might expect that they give more to the child before the child's 18, and then maybe the child gives more back to the parent later in life. That might seem different. And in some romantic relationships, some people do have more power. And a lot of times in, say, a marriage, we talk about my gender class that usually it might be seen as the person who makes more money has the power. So, but a lot of times people are looking for a partner, that in marriage, that it's not just about you, that we can share this life together. And I think that is the same idea with friendship. So I do think that sometimes our friends might need more attention than us, right? They might be going through something traumatic and they could really use a friend. Or they have a huge interview coming up, and so they just need time to themselves to prepare. And it might not feel like you're getting a lot out of it, but your time comes, right? It's a back and forth. And so I say if there is someone who's putting in more effort than the other, that it can turn out to be unhealthy, because what can happen is the underbenefited person feels like they're being taken advantage of and they're getting nothing, although they're putting in everything. And to be honest, sometimes the people who are overbenefited feel really guilty and they don't know what to do. So in some cases, they might do it on purpose. In other cases, they don't, but they don't know what to do because they're racked with guilt. So that might be something to consider. But I think most relationships should have a balance, and friendship, that's one of the main characteristics. So this goes back to Jay, right? Because again, I just felt like they flowed well together. So Jay asked, do you feel like you always have to pay back your best friend if you owe them money or vice versa? And I thought that went really well with Adrian's question about effort. And Jay, this is what I would say is friendship shouldn't be about keeping a list. Right? It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be like, well, on December 17th, 2003, I bought a value meal for you at McDonald's. And at that time, the going rate for a value meal was $4.25, right? That's a little bit too much. But if you're always taking from people and not paying them back, it goes back to you're being over-benefited and they're being under-benefited, and it's not going to be very healthy. However, there is this level of, okay, my friend got me this time. And I think most friends would be like, I'll get you back. Or they might need to be reminded like, oh yeah. But if it's always like, I lent you $10 yesterday. Where is it? It's now been 2 days. It's now been 3 days. Now, if we're talking like 3 years and they owe you $2,000, then it might be time to go see Judge Judy. But yeah, no, it shouldn't be paying back. And sometimes it might be we try to get our friends back. Hey, you lent me $5. Can I buy you a coffee when we go out to breakfast today? And some people will be like, that's great. Other people, they take their money very seriously, or that it's important to them. Maybe it's because they make all that money themselves and they didn't have money growing up, or they learned that money is ours. There's lots of things that we learn about finances and how to handle it, and borrowing and talking about it can all be individual based in terms of how we were raised. So if you know that you have a friend who does prefer being paid back, then that might be just like, for this friend, I'm going to be sure. Like, so Ferguson's sitting right here, and Ferguson is going to be very much, actually, Ferguson seems like he'd be like, get me next time, where Rooney would be like, you haven't paid me back, right? But if I know that about Rooney, then I can be sure I pay her back. But with Ferguson, I know that I might have some room. And that's something that you might have to discover in friendships, but you might also find that early in a friendship that you're going to pay them back. So I was just talking to my friend Tierney today, and we've been friends since 2003. That's like 16 years. And so, you know what? If I don't get her back right away, I know she's going to be okay. And you want to know why I know that? Because it's been 16 years, and that's been the case before, or that I've asked, or I've apologized, or any of those sorts of things. And I know that she's going to do that for me. Whereas I know there's other people in my life I want to be sure to pay back right away. So I think that's the best thing that you can do, Jay, is decide whether or not that is a person who needs to be paid back right away, needs to be paid back in the exact same way. And we only get to know that by getting to know people. And so you might not know if you can do that until 5 years into the relationship, maybe even 5 minutes into it. All right. And then the next question is from Adrian. So it's been like a Jay and Adrian tag team. And again, I just felt like these kind of went together, and then we'll move into some other questions. So Adrian's last question is, what is the golden number of people in a friend group? And the teacher in me wants to say the best group size is 5 to 7 people. This is what I teach when I teach group, okay? That 5 to 7 people allows you to have an identity together and to know each other individually and to find some sort of common purpose or goal. And I'm dropping some group communication knowledge right now. But I think a golden rule or golden number for a friend group is what works for you. And I know you're like, are you saying it depends? And I'll say yes, but with a caveat. For some people, a friendship group would be 2. And I wouldn't call it a friendship group. I would say that's a friendship pair. That's best friends. That's a best dyad. Dyad means 2. That's my best friend couple. Whatever you like to do to indicate that it's 2 people. 2 people is not a group. But then the other thing I might say is if it's so big that you don't all know each other, then that is problematic, right? I mean, to go with a school example, when I was at Michigan State University, I had this really cool experience of being in an advertising class with 30 people. We were split into 2 advertising firms of 15 people, and we had to work together. But the issue was 15 people is too many people to know, right? To know them well, to be able to get everyone together. And so what we ended up doing was splitting that group of 15, which is far too big, into smaller committees. And so I worked with 2 other people, and we were the committee that focused on the presentation. So I created the PowerPoint, and the other 2 people did the actual presentation, so preparing everything. And then we had other committees doing other things. And so sometimes, 3 is a great number. I have 5 other Murderino friends, and 6 people is perfect. But that's perfect for us. And that might not be the case for other people who prefer to have smaller group friends. Other people like to and just invite everyone. Everyone's invited. Let's put it on Facebook. We'll Snapchat it. Doesn't matter if 1,500 people show up, and that might just be too much. But I would say there's a couple things that I would consider. If you can't get everyone together at the same time, ever, then it might be too big. If not everyone fits in the couches and chairs and space that you have in your apartment or home, the group might be too big. I think those are some really tried and true principles in which to consider how you come up with your friendship groups, because you will faction. I guess I'm thinking of the Hunger Games. They had the different districts and things like that. Or, what's the one? Divergent. There's the 5 different factions. What ends up happening is much like when I'm in my advertising class, when we had to have committees, what ends up happening is when you have a large group of friends, people break off into smaller groups and pairs, which can create some friction. It might create some jealousy, or it could be just fine. So if it works for you, then great. But I always think about if you're getting too many text messages in the group text, or not everyone can ever sit at the table to play cards, or you can never get a table at a restaurant without, a 6-month advance reservation notice, then the friendship group might be too much, might be too big. But if it works for you, that's great. And so sometimes what you see is that people have different friendship groups that might overlap in some ways and maybe not. And I think when you have some smaller groups, you're able to really focus on each other and the things that you have in common. So me and my 5 Murderino friends, we met through My Favorite Murder online, through the Mitten Murderino group, waving my red flag at all my Murderino friends. And we're the ones, if you've ever listened to My Favorite Murder, we're the first ones that gave them the red flags made by my Murderino friend, Margot Cotton, America's sweetheart. And she was also in episode 8, Making Friends is Hard, so check it out. But yeah, it is and it depends. But I think there are some principles to consider. The last one I'll say, and you're probably like, well, duh, yeah, that makes sense. If people don't get along, then you might start figuring out how you can be friends with people, but in different ways. You don't always have to have everyone together. All your friends don't have to be in the room at the same time. It might be for special circumstances. So, for example, I invited all of my friends, even if they didn't live in the state, for my 40th birthday because I wanted to let everyone know that I loved them and I cared about them and I would love them to be there, but I know that Tara can't fly from Vegas for my 40th birthday, right? And the thing is, they might not all know each other, but that is a major event, and so it makes sense that you would bring friendship groups together. So thank you, Adrian. If you have an idea of what the golden number is, I want to hear all about it. Okay, so the next question is from Nigel, and he asks about how to handle a friendship conflict. And I think that's one of the major issues. And I will do a full episode on this topic. So I appreciate that you brought this up, Nigel, because I think that not only are friendships neglected, but a lot of times friendships are only seen as positive or that they should only be joyful. And it really sort of, there's an oversight to the problems that can occur. And I try to talk about those on the podcast, right? That A, we're celebrating friendships, but B, we're also going, maybe we should think about X, Y, and Z. So handling friendship conflict can be as difficult as other relationships or easier than other relationships. It might be how you handle it in the first place. And there is a great article in the communication field that I'll link to in show notes called The First Big Fight. And what they found, now they do look at romantic partners. So I realize that without doing a research study that with friendship that we can't know that we don't have support, but I think we can consider it here. Like, let's think about how this research might apply to friendship. And so what they found in the big first fight, or the first big fight, yeah, that's what they call it. In the first big fight, what they found is that whatever method of conflict people used in that first big fight carried over into their other conflicts. And so if you fight hardcore in a very competitive, dominating sense in the first conflict, that might be the default for the relationship. And so I think that can also be the case for friendship. But what you might see is that people do a lot of avoiding in friendships or passive aggressiveness because it's supposed to be all positive all the time. And so when people don't know how to handle problems when it's supposed to be positive, then we end up avoiding it, neglecting it, and just being really passive aggressive, which doesn't solve much. And I was actually thinking on February 25th was, I don't know if I want to use the word anniversary, but I can't think of another word. But on the 25th, it's been, maybe 18 to 20 years. And it's the anniversary of when I ended a friendship. I sent an email to this person and it ended at that time. And so in the future, I'll talk about friendship breakups, but this is one of the friendship breakups that I had. And I thought, and now, of course, hindsight is 2020, that especially if I was like 20, 21, 19, whatever the kid, however old I was, I think early 20s, then I might have been more concerned with myself, right? That, I've grown a lot. I've learned a lot. I've been in schooling a lot longer. I've been, I've had a lot more friendships, since then. And so from my point of view of what I remember, and we also know that our memories stink, that I tried a lot of different ways in which to approach the problems I was having with this friend, right? And I just felt like she was doing things that seemed like a violation, right? And I know this is going to sound so high school, but I liked a boy, and then she did everything she could to make it about her and him as a way to almost like create jealousy. And I know it's like, okay, I didn't marry the guy, obviously. But, I'm the kind of person that's like, I said I liked him. And if you liked him too, well, let's have a conversation, but don't do everything to make me feel bad about liking him, and doing everything that you can in which to do what you can to make it seem like you have a relationship with him. And if you might remember, there was a jealousy episode where I wrote a poem and all that. It was about her. And I'll link that episode in show notes if you like to go back and check that out. And don't forget, my poetry 19 years ago was top notch. And yes, that's sarcasm. So what I would say about friendship conflict is that it's kind of like my teaching style. Something comes up in the classroom, like the first time I might ignore it. The second time I might give them like a look. The third time it's like, okay, it's jokester Dr. Lucas time. The next time it'll be like really sarcastic. The next time I'll be like, bro, what are you doing? And then the next time is like, I'm going to pull you aside. And I give people chances and things like that, but I don't immediately want to go to 100 and be like, get out of my classroom, that kind of thing. Like, let's find other ways. But if you ignore things, you avoid it, you're passive aggressive, then what happens is that it festers and it festers and it festers like a tea kettle on the stove until the tea kettle just blows, right? And so we don't want that to happen, because that it can escalate. It can make it worse, right? And so the first thing is sort of to determine if this is an issue, right? Are we making a mountain out of a molehill, choosing our battles, every other cliche as it comes to conflict, right? And if it's something like, maybe this isn't a big deal, I kind of do like baseball, 3 strikes, So you kind of go, maybe I was wrong. Maybe they were wrong. Okay, 3rd time, this is a pattern. Okay, so I kind of observe or ignore at first, and then I try to get at it a little bit more indirectly, so not to embarrass people, to bring up the topic that I would like to discuss with them. And then I kind of move along to the point where you have to do we need to talk, right? And then might not be pretty at all, much like a breakup, romantic, friendship. It doesn't matter. It can be hurtful to everyone involved. It can be really difficult to do. And that's what I would say is you start out and sort of determine what the issue is. And then obviously the communication person in me is going to be like, well, you need to use communication, use your words, but how do we do that? And so, Nigel, that's where I'll come back with an entire episode dedicated to conflict, where I can talk about different strategies and scripts that we can use. But I think that if you're going to manage conflict in a friendship, you do have to have a conversation. And so if that's not something that's comfortable, or that's not your style of managing conflict, you might do the Dr. Lucas approach of the variations, right? Starting out like, maybe let's just ignore that. Let's give them a look, and so on and so forth. And that might help solve some of the problems. Okay, so then, which I think this next one is from Hassan, who is one of my students. Hi, thanks for the question. So this was not someone that was on America's Next Top Model. This is him. And I thought this went well with conflict, because I think it can spark conflict. And Hassan's question is, should friends ask for relationship advice from other friends who have never been in a romantic relationship? Oh, such a great question. Just in general, I think whether you're talking about romantic relationships or anything about trying to get advice, that we're going to talk to our friends whether or not they have advice, or whether or not they've had that experience, right? And so this can be problematic, because one of the things is they might have information from observations, right? And so in that case, it might be helpful to hear from them, even if they haven't had the experience. And sometimes it might sound cheesy, but maybe watching a TV show, doing a binge watch like I do, or seeing a movie, there might be some piece of info that actually could be relevant to the situation. And so one of the things, though, is you can ask your friend for advice, but that doesn't mean you have to take it. But maybe hearing what they think might come into play. Like if you gather information from different types of friends and then make your decision about what to do based on all of it, you might have a really good outsider perspective. You might have perspectives from people who have had relationships, have gone through the same thing. But I don't think it's like saying like, well, I'm never going to talk to you because you haven't had that experience. Well, then that's like saying, I study relationships, but I'm not married. So does that mean that I can't provide advice to married folks? I think I can, but I also think that they might talk to other people, and I'm okay with that. I'm like, yeah, please do, right? But I also think that my expertise in the area, or my observations, or my applications from one type of relationship to another could potentially be helpful. Maybe my advice could suck totally. Even if I was in a relationship, doesn't mean I'm going to give good advice. And so what I would say is, no matter what, especially if it's your best friend and you haven't gone through an experience, or they're really close friends, you might still talk to them about it, because I think that talking and keeping them updated on your life and asking them for advice is part of what friendship is and what people might expect, right? To get or give social support, or get or give advice. But again, it's up to you whether or not you take that advice. But friends, can I tell you an added tip here? Added tip. Okay. So if you continuously, and I can't say that I haven't been guilty of this before, so I'll just put that out there right now, that if you continuously ask for advice from friends and you never take it, and then you come back and you ask for advice about the same problem and they give you the same advice, you never take it. I think the term in pop culture or the United States culture is asshole, kind of like asshole, but get asshole. So what it means is that friends can get really frustrated if you continuously ask them for advice and you never take it. So I know, Hassan, you didn't ask that, but that's just a bonus because I've done that. I've had friends do that to me and I'm just like, why won't you ever do anything? And I'm sure Kate, who is my bestie, would be like, girl, I got some dirt on you about things that we've talked about since we've known each other starting in 1995 that you've never taken advice about. Sorry, Kate. Love you. Can't wait to talk about the same topic again. It's my favorite pastime. But I think that you could ask friends for advice, whether or not they've had experience, because maybe their siblings have, maybe their parents have, maybe they've seen something. They might be able to give you an outsider perspective, or they might have a different completely point of view because they haven't had a relationship. So I wouldn't say right away, don't ask them, but no matter who you ask, that doesn't mean you need to take their advice, whether they've been in a relationship or not. So thank you, Hassan. I'll see you in class and good luck on the exam tomorrow. All right, so next up, oh my God, folks, Tyra is in the house. Tyra Banks. Okay, no, just kidding. It's someone who sent in a question, and again, I'm using names from America's Next Top Model just in case you entered this episode halfway through. Okay, so Tyra asked, do you believe that after a breakup, the two former partners can remain friends? And what evidence do you have that causes you to believe this? And so one of the things, Tyra, thank you for the question, when I talk about breakups in my classes, that one of the things I do talk about is whether or not people will be friends after. And that discussion is based off the research of a great interpersonal scholar from the communication field, Dr. Steve Duck. And basically, Steve Duck's research would say that you can be friends with former partners. In fact, I know people who are always friends with their former partners. And then I know people who would never be friends with an ex. And so I think it might depend on personality. And again, I'm doing that. It depends because life and relationships is a gray area, but I think it's still important to talk about, right? Like what works best. Here's some things to consider. Here's some things to work through. But what Steve Duck says is that you're more likely to be friends if you were friends before you dated. So one of my MOs in terms of dating is that I'm friends with people and then we date. And so I'm more likely to be friends with them according to this research because we were friends before. But, I don't think any of my ex-boyfriends are in my life. When you have a relationship realization on air. So I think that's an excellent point, that just because the research says so doesn't mean it's the case. But that does make sense, right? That your relationship was rooted in friendship. And so it might be easy to go back to that place, right? I think it also depends on, according to his research, how you broke up, right? If they ghosted you, you're probably not like, hey, let's be friends. Cool. No, you're probably like, screw you. If they broke up in a really aggressive way, probably not. But if you broke up and it was something that was mutual, or it was really respectful, or it was really open, and you sit down and have a conversation, and with that, you're more likely to be friends with them. I think that Steve Duck had some other advice about whether or not people would be friends after they had a romantic relationship, and I can tweet those out. But I think those two are really important, right? Whether or not you were friends first and how you break up. The other thing that might be relevant would be whether or not you want to be friends with them. And it might take some time. It might not be automatic. It might take some time to become friends because you're completely changing the relationship, and that might take some time. So if you are trying to become friends with an ex, know that if that's something that you want and they've expressed that they want it too, at the very least, it's probably going to be awkward at the start. So be prepared for that. So thank you, Tyra. And don't forget to smize. Okay, that's an America's Next Top Model reference. Anyone else out there smize? That's when you smile with your eyes. It's a modeling thing. I'm not a model. I can't do it. But Tyra Banks can, and she is freaking good at it. So Google that. Okay, so now we're getting into more sort of topical areas. I have 3 more questions for this episode. And this comes from friends who are graduating. This is Eva and Anne. And it says, as graduating seniors and going off on our separate ways passive life, what advice do you have with staying connected with other roommates and friends after college besides just communication? And I'm assuming that you mean talking face to face, right? And so that you have to do more because after graduation that you might not be in the same area. So it's going to be more difficult because you lived together before and now it's like you can't. So even Anne, first off, congratulations on graduation. Yep, it's almost that time of year. We're going on spring break at Central Michigan University. Whoop, whoop. And then we have 2 months and then it's graduation. And so for students I've been working with for the last 4 years, you are growing your wings and you're flying off into the world, finding your career, going to put your stamp out on the world just like Central tells you to and teaches you to do. And it's so exciting, but also it's a huge transition. And so the first thing I would say is that whether you are graduating high school, college, moving, or changing jobs, changing relationships, that these are huge transitions in your life. And so they need to be treated as such when relationships might change. And so one of the first things I would say is that I have a episode where I talk to some podcasters and a researcher about what happens after college with friendships. It's called Friendship Changes. And I'll link that in show notes, and that might be a good episode to check out. But one of the things I say is that when you leave college, some friends you might be like, I'll be great seeing them on Twitter, or Instagram, or Facebook, and that's cool. Other people you might find, because you have things in common, you might find that you email or message each other more, or if you were classmates and you have each other's numbers, you might text each other because you have questions about careers or making connections and networking. So you might find that you have these things going on. But a lot of times it might be that there are a lot of people that you're friends with now that unfortunately you may never see again. And I know that can be really sad, but it's also life, right? Like our paths go in different ways. And so it comes down to what relationships, what friendships do you want to keep? Which ones, who are the people you're like 1,000%, I want to see them after I move. I want to see them after I graduate. I want to see them once I go to college. Whatever the case is, you might need to be selective, right? Because you might not be able to put all the investment in. And you might discover 5 years after college that you want to reconnect with someone, and that's okay too, right? Like that's great. There's people I've reconnected with, or just seeing my friends from high school on Facebook. It's really cool to stay connected that way, just to see what people are up to and so on and so forth, and be able to contact them if I need to through Messenger or just posting on their wall. So one of the things I would say besides face-to-face communication is that you need to have a conversation first before you leave campus if you can. It might be a difficult conversation. It might be tears and Kleenex and maybe drinks. Maybe you're like, I don't cry, but I drink. Well, as long as you're above the age of 21, then that's fine. Anyone under that age, I do not condone. So having that conversation might just be like, hey, you know what? Graduation's coming up in 2 months. Let's pick a date. March 31st, let's get together and have drinks and dinner and talk about where our friendships are going after college, and really just talk about what you want to do, where you're going, what your sort of progress is with finding jobs. And I'm using Eva and Anne's example here, but you can insert your example of moving. Like, I'm about to move. Let's meet on this date and let's talk about how that might change our friendship. But what can we do? Is it yearly trips? Is it we're in the same field, so we always try to be at the same conference together? Is it having a group text and maintaining it with each other? Is it having Skype dates, Google Hangouts? Is it, for most of my pod friends, a lot of them start a podcast so that they could stay in contact. What podcast are you going to host? Tell me about it. I'll promo you on Best Forevers and Fatalities. You just let me know. Especially Eva and Ann. I'll hook you up. So I think it's just becoming creative. And it's what I say all the time, that relationships are 365 days a year. So what are you going to do to maintain them? And that a lot of times people graduate and then they lose touch because they don't ever talk about it. So what might make relationship maintenance different here is that with a transition, you should have an explicit conversation. How do we see our relationship changing? What might be the obstacles that get in the way? What are some things that we can do to tear down those obstacles? What are some of the things that we do now that we love that we can continue to do? What are things that we love but we don't do now that we could do? Maybe it's creating a private, closed, secret group on Facebook and posting your goals each week and doing it. I mean, you can manifest with each other. You can be accountability buddies for working out. You can send each other funny memes. You can get together once a month. I mean, there's so many different things you can do, but it's about sitting down and doing that together and making it happen. So even Anne, I wish you the best of luck after college, after Central, fire up chips, right? But that also I wish you the best of luck in your friendships after college. All right, next up, I have a question from Janice, and it says, it's more written out, and I'll let you know I'm not going to answer this full question or respond to this full topic because I'd like it to be a full-on episode. And you'll notice that happens when people write things in. I'm like, you're right, Nigel, we should be talking about conflict. Or someone sent me a question about people-pleasing, and I was like, oh, no, we need to talk about people-pleaser and friendships. Let's do that. So that's an episode coming up. So I love the questions. I want to be able to help, but also things that I know are commonly experienced or might be particularly difficult for people to manage. I want to have full episodes on, or just continuously talking about it. It doesn't have to be one episode and done. It's just something that we can continue to discuss because we need to. Friendship matters. Okay, so back to Janice. Says, I like you to speak on the problems that some straight and gay friends may face. For example, casually talking about sex sometimes just doesn't happen because neither party feels comfortable due to a lack of understanding or lack of comfort on the topic. Also, the issue of being referred to as, quote, the gay friend or, quote, the lesbian friend out of the group of friends. Janice says that she has personal experience with it and she considers it to be quite demeaning. So, Janice, thank you for the question. I think one episode or more, like I said, continued conversations is needed on this topic. And so if there are any of my listeners who would like to contribute to this episode, feel free to email me at bestforeverspod@gmail.com because I'd love to have your insight here and I would love to talk about it. But as you might have wagered a guess over the last 68 episodes, I am a cis white gendered woman who is heterosexual, right? Like, I mean, how many times have I talked about Gareth Reynolds? Come on, folks. Spoiler alert. But also, although I feel like these are things I could talk about, it's not my personal experience. So like Hassan brought up, I can give advice, but I don't want to be the only one giving advice. So if there are people who have experiences or thoughts or opinions about this or expertise, I want to hear from you. Please let me know. But here's how I'll address Janice's two topics, right? The first one is about sex talk. And first off, there are some people who are uncomfortable talking about sex no matter who it is. I do know from the research that I've conducted, which has been several studies where I've asked people whether or not they talk about sex with their friends. And consistently, it's like 95% or above that people talk about sex with their friends. So those conversations are a phenomenon, but it doesn't mean everyone's doing it. But it's also a phenomenon that I need to continue to do because I know there have been research and other articles that say that millennials, sorry to use that word, because I feel like it's always used negatively, like, oh, millennials are ruining everything. Isn't that like every generation, right? Everyone ruins everything, right? But millennials might be having less sex. And so if you're having less sex, you might talk about it less or you might talk about it more. And I think that might be an interesting research study to look into is how things are changing, right? And so the first thing, Janice, I would say is taking out gender or sexual identity, that there are just some people who are uncomfortable with it. And I think that in our life that most often there's a heterosexual bias in our society and in the world. And so the only thing that people hear about or see about or stories or whatever the case is usually heterosexual. And so I think especially perhaps for heterosexual friends, it might be like they don't even know where to start because they're like, you do what? How? What? Like, or they have misconceptions or they don't want to say something wrong or And in some cases, you might have people who just are like, I'm okay. I mean, I hate to say this, but there might be some people who are like, I don't care that you're gay, but I don't want to hear about it. That's me trying not to vomit. But I mean, those are some considerations perhaps, right? But I think that on the other side of it is that because it's so heterosexual focused, that folks that don't fit into that sexual identity might not feel comfortable talking about it because there aren't many people who are, or at least not in a widespread situation. So I think that no matter what, we should be talking about relationships and sex sooner. And it should change with age so that it's age appropriate. But we need to talk about it more. And can I just say, we need to have more stories and media representation for people who are not heterosexual. I just added HBO on Hulu, and folks, my life has changed. And don't even ask me about how much sleep I've gotten in the last week, because I've been watching movies besides America's Next Top Model. And I just watched the movie Love, Simon. Oh my God. I think it's based on a book, and if it is, I definitely want to read it. But it wasn't something, and it might be also that I'm 40, but I didn't know about this story. I had heard about the movie. I just didn't get a chance to see it in the theater. And it's about a high school boy who is gay, but he hasn't told anyone. And it's about feeling comfortable coming out. And how do you tell your friends? How do you tell your parents? How do you operate in the world? And I just think that having more stories like that makes more people aware and understanding of everything that's going on. So I definitely think that sex talk might be different, whether it's an all heterosexual group, an all LGBT group, or some mixed gender and sexual identity group. And so I to be honest, I'm not aware of research that does any comparisons of those. In fact, in my research that I've done, and I've paused my research as I try to finish up some results from a longitudinal study that I did, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's just collected over time. So there's just a lot of information. It's never ending. One day, friends, because I'll share it with you. But I'm not, even in my research, I can tell you the majority of people who participate have been heterosexual, and that the next study, I was just talking to someone about how I would need to oversample an LGBTQ community and wanting to work with the Office of LGBTQ Services on campus so I could do that, because I think research is also heterosexual biased. So Janice, I appreciate your question, and I can wager a guess that it's very comfortable because there is that lack of understanding and comfort, and a lot of it is how we're raised, our sex education, what we see in the media, and so much more, and that even our research might not support it. And so, like I said, I'd like to do a whole episode. I'm going to do more of a deep dive into research and see what I can find, maybe outside of the communication field, and come back with information that I can share. I can have people come on and talk about their experiences, and we can just learn more about it. But to address your second part about the issue of being the gay friend or the lesbian friend, I think that was something, maybe perhaps with Will and Grace, and like I said, we haven't had a lot of media that has representation of the LGBT community. And so something like Will and Grace maybe sort of glamorizes the idea of having the gay best friend. And so Will and Grace, right? She's straight, he's gay. And then you have Karen, who's straight, and you have Jack, who's gay, who are also best friends. And I think that for some time, it is sort of a stereotype that, I'm the gay best friend. And I think that labeling that, unless the person is like, you can call me the gay best friend, or in another group, it's our straight friend, Alysa. Unless people are okay with that, I wouldn't use that, because I think that it would suggest that it's a tokenism, right? Well, in this large group of friends, we only have one gay friend, or we only have one lesbian friend. Well, is there not room for more? Does it mean that, what does it mean? What are you trying to say with that? And so, and for some people, it might be like, we love that label, or it's my work spouse and he's gay, or she's my work spouse and she's gay. I mean, I think we see a lot of that. But again, in a world with a heterosexual bias, I think that we kind of create these ways in which to have these relationships that might not be seen as okay. And so, we have bromance for male friendship. It's not okay for friends to be men, right? Like men, it's okay, you can be friends. And so I think in some ways it could be positive as a way to be like, yes, I have gay friends, what about it? But if you're just like, I just have the one, that's, we're not taking any more applications, then I can see why Janice would see that as quite demeaning. I think it's a way as when people say something like, we're just friends. Oh, she's just my gay friend. That it makes it seem like less than, where it's like, we should just be friends. Like sexual identity in the grand scheme of things shouldn't matter. At times it will. At times a lot of things matter. But overall, when we're talking about media use, it shouldn't be like, Will and Grace are gay and straight best friends. It's my gay best friend. That it should just be like, these are people who live together and they're friends. He just happens to be gay and she happens to be straight. Like, it should be about us living and breathing and being who we are without it being like a spotlight on these things. So what I would say is that I would agree with Janice that I would see that as demeaning. I wouldn't like to be like, you're the one of this, like I think that happens with race as well. But if people are okay with it, and I mean truly okay with it, they just don't go along with it because they don't know what else to say. But in that case, I think that it works for their friendship. And so what they might find is that they have some backlash from outside the relationship, and they might need to do a little bit more work communicating to other people about it, right? Other people might have questions. So, Janice, I can't wait to do more on this topic. So thank you so much for writing in. All right, last topic is from Camille. And this says, one topic of friendship I would be interested in hearing your perspective on would be how social media affects friendships. And I do have one episode called FOMO, so I can link that in show notes. That was a fun episode to put together because I think that's something that we all experience and that it can be problematic for friendship. But I think what Camille is talking about here is even more in depth than what we talked about on that episode. And that is this idea of subtweeting, which I didn't learn about until my student Lacey. Shout out to Lacey, love her. Oh gosh, even though she's graduated and she was a graduate student, she's moved on and been gone, still think of her so fondly. So Lacey, if you're listening, love you. But I remember her telling me what a subtweet was because I didn't know what it was. And so it sounds like it's a passive-aggressive way to communicate with someone about something you're not happy with, but you do it on Twitter. So the tweet has a secondary meaning than what it might have on its surface level. So thank you, Lacey. If I've got that wrong, please let me know. Correct me. But it says, I recently lost some friends over a tweet I retweeted because I thought it was funny, but they thought it was my way of being petty toward them after a recent conversation we had disagreed on about going somewhere together. Instead of fighting for the friendships, I let them go because I thought it was very immature to even deal with this when I wasn't trying to be malicious whatsoever. So what I'd like to hear you discuss on your podcast is how you would deal with a situation like this and what you think about subtweets and the effects they have. So thank you, Camille, for writing in. And what I would say is that if it was a subtweet, then, you might go, they could take this wrong. But it sounds like it was just something that you saw and it's funny. And then other people look at it and then they add their interpretation to it, right? So perception is reality. If I think that you subtweeted at me, then I think you did. Like you did, right? From my point of view. And from your point of view, you're like, but I didn't. And so you can see where there could be a problem when both people see it differently. And so one of the things I would say is that a lot of times this happens where we have different perceptions or there's misunderstandings, and actually just talking about it might clear it up. And maybe it's like, there's a couple things that I think you could do. It's up to you. I think a lot of people probably experience this. And I'm sure there are people who've seen my Facebook posts or Twitter, I almost said tweeter, Twitter posts, and that they might have been like, look at this girl trying to post about this, this, or that. And I might not even have any idea that they think that. They might just see it that way. Like, I post a lot of things about animals, and it could be about the workplace, it could be about friendship, romantic relationships, could just be something funny, something gross. I love animals, but sometimes people will be like, that girl posted this thing, and I think she's talking about me. And what I would say to people is, most often, if you look at a tweet, unless your name is in it, it's probably not about you. And if people start talking about it, that might be gossip or rumor, depending on the situation, right? And so a lot of times, the problem with subtweets is, and believing in subtweets, is that you can't confirm it as true or false, right? And what's unfair about subtweets, if it's not actually a subtweet, is that people can be wrongly, quote unquote, convicted for something that they didn't do. So Camille's like, I just thought this was funny. But maybe one of the things that Camille didn't consider is that she thought it was funny because of that situation, but she didn't make that connection, right? Sometimes you just see things and you're like, oh, that's funny because it's just a topic you've been thinking about. Or she could have just been like, this is hilarious and it has nothing to do with it, or this is hilarious and it has something to do with it. And she's like, it's not a subtweet. And maybe you're right, like ending a friendship or getting that upset over one tweet might be problematic. And so maybe a way to resolve subtweeting is to first, you could look at it and go, I've been in conflict with someone. Is this something that they might misread? And it might cause bigger problems. Some of you might be like, no, I can tweet and Facebook whatever I want. And like I say, hashtag you do you. The second thing you might consider is if you're looking at people's Twitter, that most often they're not talking about you. In fact, they might not even be thinking about you at all. And I think that's part of the problem is we read into things too far and we assume people are thinking about us. And this might be really unfortunate to say, but I think people say this all the time in the sense of when I've gotten mad at people and I'm like, but then they did this. And my mom will be like, they don't care about you. And I mean, it sounds sad, but a lot of times it's like, they're not worried about you. They're worried about themselves. Like we are focused inward than we are outward. So most likely they're not thinking about you, which is why a perfect solution, well, perfect might be a strong term. A possible solution would be just having a conversation. Were you referring to this? No, I just thought it was funny. But if you think it's problematic, I'll delete it if you care about the friendship. If you don't, which maybe these weren't a good friendship, then you move on. You're like, I'm going to tweet about whatever I want. And what's interesting are these are things that we've never really had to consider before we had social media. And now we have to truly think about the impact of our social media, or thinking that people might take too much out of our social media and apply that to our in real life relationship. And that can be problematic in a lot of ways. So Camille, basically, I think if you disagreed on something and you couldn't come to a head, then maybe it's better off that you're not friends. If it happened too quickly and maybe a conversation could have helped the misunderstanding, I think that's a great solution. And then I always think that if you're not sure about a tweet, then maybe it shouldn't be a tweet, right? Or that you can delete, but be careful because people screen grab. Am I right? So if you want to know more about subtweeting or you have any other questions about social media or any of the other things that we talked about or anything we didn't talk about today, be sure to let me know. So until next time, think about those questions you have that would help you in terms of understanding or improving your friendships, because without our friends, who would we be? Thanks for listening to Best Forevers. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe, rate, review, and of course, share with a friend. Please be sure to follow Best Forevers on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Best Forevers Pod, and I'm at Dr. Alysa Lucas on Twitter. You can always find the podcast webpage for more information at bestforeverspod.com, and share your stories of friendship by emailing me at bestforeverspod@gmail.com. And if you'd like to support the movement to love on our friends more, check out the podcast on patreon.com/bestforeverspod. Now, friends, check out this recommended podcast that you must get in your ear holes immediately.
Are you looking for a history podcast to grab some quotes for a last-minute paper? Or maybe your presentation on Jane Eyre needs a punch-up?
Then do not listen to us.
Do not.
Like, we're begging of you.
I'm Ashley.
And I'm Kelsey, and we host Make It Modern, a podcast where we talk about history, literature, and all things made before the year 2010 in a way that would probably be frowned upon by any teacher.
We basically delve into the past and stumble into the present.
We discuss things like what type of rosé is appropriate for a medieval execution,
and how we've all been Bingley'd one time or another.
So if you love hearing about people, places, and things with so many issues they could be a Julia Michaels song, join us every Thursday on Spotify and iTunes.
And be sure to follow us on Facebook at Make It Modern, and also on Twitter and Instagram at @MIM_podcast.